In 1937, Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, disappeared mysteriously during their attempted round-the-world flight. Years after disappearing into the Pacific Ocean, despite America's biggest-ever rescue mission, no trace of either Earhart or Noonan was ever discovered. After nearly 9 decades of speculation, this legendary flying enigma has taken a turn. Until last year, neither the remains of the pilot nor the wreckage of the plane had been found. Where did the plane hide for so long, and what finally happened to Earhart's plane? Join us as we solve one of history's greatest flying mysteries. What forged a spirit daring enough to vanish into myth? To solve Amelia's disappearance, we must trace her rebirth, not lost to the ocean but born for the heavens. Did her fate begin with a Kansas girl who defied gravity and its rules? Amelia Earhart's destiny was never linked to earthly pursuits. Even before stepping inside an airplane for the first time, she had a spirit that could not be contained by established conventions. Compared to those who blindly followed predetermined conventions, she was driven by an insatiable thirst for discovery and knowledge. From the very beginning, she had an invincible conviction that the meaning of life was not to fit what society deemed fitting. Perhaps this independent character was the identifying aspect that set her apart and called her to her heavenly calling. Born on the 24th of July, 1897 in Atchison, Kansas, Amelia manifested a distinctly nonconformist personality. While her contemporaries spent their leisure time in normal play activities, she engaged in much more adventurous play, tree climbing, racing through grassy spaces, and stretching boundaries of what might be regarded as proper behavior in a young lady of her age. Her closest friend was her younger sister Muriel, who shared her sense of adventure. They both avoided the conventional activities of tea parties and dolls, instead focusing their energies on construction projects and exploration, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the potential of their world. One of her most remarkable childhood adventures was constructing a homemade roller coaster in her backyard. Together with Muriel, they employed wooden boards, boxes, and other items to create a track from the roof of their tool shed. After finishing it, Amelia ascended to the top, sat inside her makeshift vehicle, and slid down the track. Even though the experience was a crash, with scraped knees and knocked-out breath, her response was characteristically upbeat. She stood up with a triumphant smile. In later life, she would recall the experience as closely akin to the feeling of flight. Her parents were unaware, however, that this initial experience was the beginning of the adventures ahead. Aviation at that time had not yet entered her awareness. Her attention instead shifted to pioneering women who had pushed through barriers in life, successful physicians, athletes, and adventurers. Her scrapbook, filled to the brim with newspaper reports on these path-paving women, was not just inspirational, it was tangible proof that she too could achieve greatness. But her youth was not entirely spent adventuring and daydreaming. There had been difficulties in domestic life, primarily brought about by her father Edwin Earhart's drinking problem, which created instability in the home. The turning point in her life was in December 1920, when Amelia and her father visited an air spectacle in Long Beach, California. Even though she had never previously considered aviation a career, observing planes soaring in the air made an inner shift in her. Flight at the time was still a relatively new and dangerous activity, commonly thought of as a man's sport. But when her father organized for her to ride on a short flight with pilot Frank Hawks, Amelia experienced an epiphany. The moment the plane lifted off from the ground, she was certain this was no mere entertainment, it was freedom. It was purpose. She knew later that the experience was one of profound connection, as though the sky had been calling her all her life and she had finally responded to its beckoning. From that moment on, Amelia was determined to be a pilot. The gap between dreams and reality was wide, though. Flight training was costly, and flight schools were especially hostile to female pupils. Undeterred, Amelia worked a string of jobs to earn the funds needed: truck driving, photography, and stenography, sending every dollar she earned toward flying lessons. In 1921, her perseverance finally bore fruit as she earned enough money for her first formal training. Her instructor, Nita Snook, was also among the rare women pilots of her generation. Nita soon understood that Amelia was no normal student. She possessed unflinching dedication and an irresistible passion to master the art of flying. Her commitment to perfection was unveiled through her rapid progress. Within 6 months, Amelia had enough money to purchase her own airplane, a shiny yellow Kinner, which she christened the Canary. The little plane was strong and reliable, and she experienced the true freedom of the air. Flying became a total passion with her. She practiced with dogged dedication, constantly striving to master new techniques, increase her speed, and build her confidence. In 1922, she achieved her first major milestone by flying to an altitude of 14,000 feet, higher than any woman had ever flown. This was merely the beginning of what would prove to be a distinguished career. She soon became a skilled flyer and a powerful force for women's empowerment. The crossing was achieved. Although Amelia had technically achieved a historic milestone, she was not pleased with her success. She afterward confessed that she had not felt any more significant than a cargo of freight being flown across the ocean. The fact that she had not flown the plane herself left her with a sense of incompleteness. The world, however, saw her achievement differently. As she emerged from the plane, she was met with hyperbolic devotion. Reporters swarmed about her, scrambling to capture every aspect of her journey. She had her picture in the papers worldwide, and she was toasted as a heroine. New York welcomed her with a ticker-tape parade, and she received an invitation to the White House. Amelia was overnight an icon representing progress and valor. Putnam encouraged her not to let the moment slip by. He assisted her in publishing 20 Hours, 40 Minutes, a book regarding her flight adventures over the Atlantic. She traveled on a speaking tour around the country promoting women in aviation and giving speeches. She even launched a brand of practical yet stylish clothing for women pilots. Nevertheless, with all the publicity and success, Amelia felt incomplete. Gaining international recognition, she was well aware that she hadn't made a name for herself as a pilot. Although the world regarded her as a record breaker, she had an inner desire to merit the title. She did not want to go down in history as the first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger. She wanted to go down in history as the first woman to fly it alone. Her second act would send the entire world awry. Resolute in doing so, she trained for it. The preparations were done. By 1932, a streamlined red Lockheed Vega 5B airplane was chosen to go on this trip, and on May 20th, she boarded the same and prepared for the impending battle. The plan was to depart from Harbor Grace, Newfoundland, and land in Paris, following the route of Charles Lindbergh's historic solo flight 5 years earlier. But the flight quickly became a battle for survival. Minutes into the flight, Amelia faced ferocious headwinds that battered her aircraft. As the hours passed, ice began to form on the wings, which would have weighed down the aircraft. One of her instruments also failed, and her altimeter broke, so she could not read her altitude. She was by herself in the vast sky and had to rely entirely on instinct and experience to navigate safely. After nearly 15 hours in the air, she finally spotted land below her, but it wasn't Paris. High winds had pushed her off course. She was over Ireland instead. Not wishing to take any further risks, she landed in a farmer's field near Culmore, a small village in Northern Ireland. As a farmer approached her, her first question was, "Where am I?" She hadn't reached her destination, but that didn't matter. She had accomplished what no woman in history ever had before. She had soloed the Atlantic on her own terms. There could be no doubt this time. Amelia had won her place in history. The world rejoiced once again. But this time, the praise was somehow different. She had not only matched Lindbergh's feat but had accomplished it under more challenging conditions, without a working altimeter and in a less advanced airplane than his. She received numerous honors, including the Distinguished Flying Cross, and was the first woman to receive a high military distinction. The King of England congratulated her, and President Herbert Hoover invited her to the White House. She had now become one of the greatest aviators of her time. Despite her success, Amelia showed no signs of slowing down. The Atlantic flight had only reinforced her desire to do more. In 1935, she became the first person to fly solo from Hawaii to California, a more risky route than the Atlantic flight. The Pacific was unpredictable with no safe emergency landing spots. Many people had attempted this flight before her, but none had succeeded. She did it, though, with the same determination that had driven her previous flights. She broke many records, including being the first woman to complete a solo nonstop flight across the United States and the fastest transcontinental flight by a woman. Each of her achievements cemented her status as a pioneer, not just in aviation, but in inspiring generations to follow.